know, given current events, this question's on my mind. And I have a feeling it's on a lot of yours as well. Climate change, poverty, settler and native conflicts, police brutality, labor issues. These are all huge, epic problems that we all now need to solve. It's easy to feel discouraged, powerless, to change the world in any tangible way. I believe this is a problem when we phrase these as epic scale issues. How do I solve sexism? Is there any person who can solve sexism? Right? But somehow we are asking ourselves that. Instead, I believe we need to take a more grassroots, ordinary people efforts in order to solve our problems. The things that are happening in local communities, between people, instead of these worldwide problems. And I believe the process for that everyday activism is one through play. Now, I'm not the only person to suggest games and play can be used for social good. About 6 years ago, Jay McGonigal gave a very influential TED Talk about how everyday gameplay can be used to solve epic problems. There's also a whole industry called serious games dedicated to social impact games, using play for education and social interests. There's even an organization called Games for Change, which has been around for over a decade, committed to endorsing games for social impact. So how much have games actually changed the world? We have no idea. So I wish I had a really fancy bar graph to show you how social issues were before and after games came along, but there's been very little research on that topic. Not only do very few developers and companies release data on how much they've impacted target audiences and interests, little do that data collection in the first place. And I think this is a huge problem when an entire medium promised to solve these epic, wide-scale problems. So you probably have seen some things like this, right? You know, this is World of Warcraft. But you probably have seen things like points, levels, progression bars, quests. You know, they've been kind of infiltrating our sort of everyday life, trying to get us more interested in social issues. So all these, as you might know, where World of Warcraft comes from, is the entertainment product industry of video games. Video games are really good at engagement, getting people interested, keeping people focused on one problem to solve. They're not really that great at getting people involved and communicating about complex issues, about staying in the long term for vague goals that you never know will pan out. That's not good for social activism. That's like choosing a spoon to cut your steak. That's not going to be a really great steak after the spoon. You're going to be pretty upset because you spent a really long time trying to cut that steak. Instead, I want everyone to consider other opportunities for play. Play actually is embedded in our everyday lives. Think about, we play social roles, right? Gender roles, racial roles, class roles, ones that we choose to have and ones that are forced upon us. We play with our food. We sometimes play with each other's hearts. We play along with what life gives us. We also very explicitly play in economic systems, choosing why and how and where we spend our money. In fact, we play with everyday life more than we play with games. And I feel like if we're going to focus on games and play, we should do what people are already doing to activate wide-scale change. And this is a useful praxis for us. Because we're so used to trying to accomplish the big one, end world hunger. Just change the world. But instead, this sort of everyday play, it's small grains of sand that we all can use to build up into an impenetrable wall. It lets us all be drops in a wave. And I think we need to start thinking of ourselves more that way, instead of us thinking we need to turn into that wall or turn into that wave by ourselves. Citing one of my favorite theorists, queer and performance scholar Jose Esteban Munoz, my colleague Mary Copes sees games as models for utopia, that we can imagine our futures in this imaginary but not completely unreal space when we play with one another. And we can't just jump to utopia right away, right? We can't just make our ideals come from whatever higher plane that we all observe down to earth. Instead, we can use play as gesturing, as signaling to one another the new realities, the better futures that we envision. Because utopia is not just this endpoint. Utopia is never going to arrive. I will die in a racist world. And with games now, how they're used, you're supposed to win. You're supposed to accomplish the goal. But I'm not a loser. And no one else is a loser. So that's why we need to change our perspective. Thinking about this everyday play, how we interact. We're so focused on these large, epic scale issues that we forget the people who are sitting right next to us, the people in our lives. When's the last time you radically changed the person next to you? Something tells me you work tirelessly, thinking, trying to do something larger, but the small bits always kind of run through your fingers. So instead of winning, I want to kind of use a little term called infinite games, done by religious scholar James P. Carse. And infinite games, or infinite play, it's a kind of play that doesn't stop. It actually perpetuates itself. Think of it as a sort of yes and from improv, right? I do something, and my action leaves a space for you to respond. And then you take that space and you respond as well in your unique way and leave space for me to respond, and we just keep going. This is the sort of play I'm thinking about, instead of goals, instead of winning. Now, it's not a secret that we have a bit of a diversity problem in the tech sector, especially video games. White men take up the vast majority of decision-making roles. And even though that's starting to change, the vast majority of people who are making and creating games are white. Now, coupled with the lack of research and not a lot of accountability of actually impacting the world, we have ineffective games at best, but most often it's very exploitative towards the people that we're hoping to help. So I want to share with you some inspiration that powers me and hopefully will power and enable you in everyday play. The first is from performance art. Alan Capro coined a term called happenings. These are kind of anti-art performance that takes place and is almost indistinguishable from everyday life. So the programs for these performances, they would have rules of what the performer would be doing, very specific time, location, duration, and the performer would go out, usually in public, and perform their piece. And very often, people around them had no idea they were doing that performance. I really think that that's fascinating, that someone is expressing something about our lives, and maybe we don't notice it in the noise, but it's affecting us. What power that is. Everyone can do that. I think the formal nature of these programs, of happenings, are a great starting point for creators, people, and institutions to start making everyday play. So a bit ago, there was this DIY revolution in video games, punctuated by the publishing of The Rise of the Video Game Zinesters by Anthropy. And what this was putting light on game-making tools that didn't require programming. Sometimes didn't require you being an artist of visual or audio. And as we know, programming knowledge and game-making knowledge is gated. It's not very diverse inside those gates. So what happens when all of a sudden everyone can make a game? Well, as you might expect, we got a lot of different kinds of play. So instead of winning and challenges and quests, we got games about self-care. We got games about prison abolition. Games about consensual and safe sex practices. Now, try to think about the last time you went to Walmart to pick up a video game that had any of those themes in them, right? It's just, when we use this sort of small-scale model, and if you pick up on the title, zine-like, it kind of calls in the 90s of radical queer and feminist communities who use zines to communicate to one another. We can use games for that too. And it's also super useful to use design outside of games in order to imagine these new futures. In particular, I'm interested in transition design out of Carnegie Mellon. Now, it comes from trying to use service design or experience design in order to deal with the fact that climate change is here, it's happened, and we have to deal with it. We can't stop it. We're already kind of done enough. So what do we do to transition from today in our practices into a future that everyone can do? Now, I'm really interested in this sort of design because it doesn't have an end. It's more concerned with wicked problems, or problems that require a whole bunch of messy things to be taken into account that can't be easily solved, like trying to change the behavior and thoughts of a large group of people, like a nation. So I want to show a couple of examples, and I don't really believe that everyday play has to be these discrete art objects. And in fact, I think they should be more subliminal, more acted through between us. But I want to show you some experiments that I did. The first is my own zine-like game, My Nietzsche. I made this for my best friend, who, after her and I know we spend a lot of our time together, was still confused about my mental state, wondering why I'm depressed. So I made a game about what it took for me to go get a cup of coffee with her, as if it was just another day. I showed the choices I had to make as someone who's trans, someone who's black, my appearance, and show her what happens when I make those decisions. What happens to me on the street? What happens to me when I'm trying to buy a cup of coffee? And she went through and toiled and went through all the choices and saw all the outcomes. And there's some things you just can't explain with words. And I think play helps us bridge that gap. Now, after My Nietzsche was published back in 2012, we've seen a lot of empathy experiences with technology. These are supposed to be interactive experiences in which help you empathize with others. But what I started to notice that this was happening to my work, where people would take my game that I made for my best friend and say, learn about being trans. Learn about being black. This wasn't for you. And so I made my game Empathy Machine, where I used physical computing to make my body a game controller and had people play my game as I tried to reenact my everyday life. Now, at first, I tried to do the whole, cool artist thing. I didn't talk, I didn't make eye contact. But then I started to notice that people were reaching out to speak to me. And eventually I started to talk to them. And there was a vulnerability there. I mean, sure, yes, I'm the one who's, mostly naked, being touched and groped, but they were also being vulnerable, doing that in a space where that is unacceptable. Taking a chance to be like, there's something here and it's super uncomfortable, but I'm going to try something. And I think we could use that moment more in our lives to beckon that from one another. And the last one I'll share with you is called EAT. It's back to those programs of rules. I made this for an ex-partner of mine who had trouble understanding what it's like to be saddled with student debt and not in a market that is looking to hire me. And I'm sorry if that's too soon for many of you here. But I wanted to communicate this feeling. Not only what does it mean not to get a job and to have a lot of money to pay back to people I don't know, but what does it mean to be a woman that has to do that? Black, trans, all these things, living in San Francisco. What does that mean? So I made a program, and I had him follow some rules during his everyday life to maybe catch a glimpse. Now, he doesn't understand my experience. He never will, because I lived it, and we're too different. But there was a connection. There was a place for conversation. There was a place for sharing. And sometimes we need that just to get to the heart of it. We're too built up about being morally good to really admit to other people, we fuck up. We participate in these systems, and we don't know how to stop. We have to be honest about those things, and I believe this sort of everyday play is going to help us get there. So I want to leave you with this. You're not a loser for not solving epic problems, because that's not how it works. Instead, I want you to consider what it will take to connect with the people in your life, to radically change the people you love and care about, and then after that, people that you don't know, people on the outskirts of your community. I really believe that people like me need others who are advantaged to start doing this, because I need help. There's many of us that need help, and we need you to reach out. Thank you.